When you play the Game of Thrones, you
subscribe and like,
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Comics YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be doing a character analysis that a lot of you guys wanted in the poll I did about 2 weeks ago, I think, at this point. But this was the second option that was the most popular. We did Aemond last week, so if you guys haven't checked out that one, I would check out that one. As it relates a lot to this one, they're both going to be very similar characters in their manners and their motivations. But yeah, that one I thought was a really good video. It's one of my favorite videos to record. I think this is also going to be a very fun video to record because Aemond, Maegor, and Daemon Targaryen, they're all very similar. They're all motivated by kind of the same things almost, but a little differently. I also wanted to say a couple announcements here before we get into the video. One, this will be our last character analysis we will be doing until probably either the end of December or the new year. There is a reason for that, as you guys will find out. I'm going to be doing a very big announcement on Monday, and it's going to affect pretty much the rest of December and or the New Year's videos. And you guys will kind of find out about that on Monday, so stay tuned for that. I will be doing a community post. I might do a little tiny video with it, and then also be on my Instagram as well. And then also, if you guys have any questions, whether that be related to Maegor that you want me to answer, whether that be anything Song of Ice and Fire related, we are going to be doing a Q&A. We are getting very close to 2,000, a lot faster than I expected. We're getting pretty close. So if you guys have any questions, we're going to be doing a Q&A for a live stream for the 2,000 subscriber special. That'll be kind of anything you guys want. Could be related to me, anything else in Song of Ice and Fire. So with that being said, strap in. This is going to be a very long video, probably longer than Aemond's. And let's get into Maegor the Cruel. And was he really cruel? So Maegor the Cruel, or Maegor Targaryen, was born on the year 12 AC to Visenya and Aegon Targaryen. So for the people that don't know, I'm assuming a lot of you know this, but Aegon had two wives, Visenya and Rhaenys. They both had children with Aegon, and that's how we have two different sides. So we have another side of this where Rhaenys gives birth to Aenys Targaryen. Now, something I want to point out from the very beginning is the differences between Aenys and Maegor. Maegor, when he is born, is much bigger than Aenys. And this kind of goes to even look at the idea that Maegor just was someone that was a better fighter, a more violent person than Aenys, where Aenys was someone that was much more reserved. He was quick to inaction. He really tried to appease and please everyone. He's very similar to Viserys in that way. And Maegor was someone that was brought up very differently, right? Maegor was someone that was very much a mama's boy, where he was trained and he was very much influenced by his mother, Visenya. And for anyone that doesn't know, of the two wives of Aegon, Visenya was more of the warrior princess. She was the one that was always fighting. She had Dark Sister. She was more of the violent or cruel one of the two between her and Rhaenys. And this very much passes on to Maegor. So Maegor, it is said that he was given a training sword or a toy sword at the age of 3. That is insane just to begin with. But that is basically the two paths Aenys and Maegor were on. Where Maegor was always on this path of becoming a great warrior, where Aenys was on this path of he needs to be good at ruling, kind of you're the heir to Aegon, you have a big shoes to fill, right? Where Maegor was kind of down a different route, and that takes them on two different paths. Now, Maegor took to swordplay from a very early point. And what I think is interesting is how Maegor is looked at and how the victors, so Jaehaerys, how Maegor is perceived as a character. So it is said that Maegor apparently butchered a cat. Very similar to something Joffrey does. In the normal story, well, actually it's a little before the normal story, but it's in that time period. I am of the belief that this probably didn't happen. I don't think Maegor probably did this. This is probably something people later on just started a rumor of that Maegor did. Again, we always talk about this idea that the victors write history. This happens with World War I. This happens with World War II. This happens with many other time periods within our own history. And this is how I look at it. I think this is something that probably never happened, but it's something that the victors of the war probably wrote into existence. With that being said, at the age of 8, and this is confirmed, this is not a rumor, he stabbed to death a palfrey which had kicked him, and slashed half the face off the stable boy who came running towards the animal's screams. So this is the beginning of Maegor's cruelty. And what I think is interesting, and this is what we always come back to in a lot of these character analysis, is there's no repercussions to this, right? Maegor is showing very violent and cruel tendencies from a very young age, at the age of 8. And there's no real discussion here. Aegon doesn't, look at this with concern. Visenya doesn't look at this with concern. This is just fine. Like this, because Maegor is a prince and he has such high standing, no one's going to tell him to any different outside of 2 or 3 people in his life, and they don't say anything. So it's interesting to look at this idea where, from an early age, Maegor is allowed to get away with violence. And we always talk about the idea that as a child or a kid, you are very impressionable. The things you get away with when you are younger, you will think you can get away with them later on in your life. So this is where I think Maegor will start to learn that he can be violent, he can be cruel, and really get away with it for the most part. And this is a moment that I think gets overlooked in his character development, but it's something that will impact him later on in his life. Also at this age, so again, this is another idea I want to talk about before I get into the next point, is that we talk about with Aemond that violence always gave Aemond power. Whether it was station, whether it was respect, whether it was this or that. And at this age, the age that I just talked about, him stabbing a palfrey and slashing half the face of a stable boy, he becomes a squire. A very interesting time to make him a squire. So again, we see violence giving Maegor things. Now, we take a little bit of a skip here. We're going to focus on more of his training and his who he actually becomes as a sword fighter. And we're going to talk about some of the politics going on as well during this time. But when he was 12, he begins to unhorse boys 4 to 5 years older than him. So he is 12, unhorsing boys that are 16, 17. That's crazy in its own right. It shows you how well Maegor has been trained and how amazing of a jouster. Another thing to talk about here is violence has been really all Maegor has known. At the age of 13, Visenya gives him one of the greatest swords in history, Dark Sister. When he was 13, he is getting Dark Sister. So again, this just continues to show the trend of a lot of these characters like a Maegor, like a Daemon, like an Aemond. Violence gets them things. It grants them power. Now, again, we have another parallel, because, again, I'm going to talk about this a lot, is that Maegor's childhood was very similar to Aemon's and also Daemon's, but Maegor never claims a dragon. And this is something that his sister, Alyssa Velaryon, kind of gives him shit for, where she is saying, you can claim a dragon and all these things, like we can get you an egg. And Maegor's like, no, there's one dragon that is fit for me. And we know, of course, that he is referring to Balerion the Black Dread. Again, very similar to Aemond, where Aemond is teased for not having a dragon, so he picks the most powerful one. So people know to not take him as a joke kind of ever again. And that's the way Maegor... So again, we can see a lot of parallels between Maegor and Aemond from a very young age. Now let's move on to what's going on in the kingdom. So at the kingdoms at this point, there's been a big idea of what is the succession looking like? Since Maegor was born, Maegor has been the Prince of Dragonstone, right? Because there's no other heirs that Aenys has had yet up to this point. Now, Aenys eventually marries his sister Alyssa Velaryon, and they have a child named Rhaena. Now, this begins another idea that's very interesting that won't really come into effect, but it's almost a little bit of a foreshadow to the Dance of the Dragons. And what I think was happening here is we can almost see the Maesters trying to set that up to happen. Because we see here that the Faith does not want Maegor to marry Rhaena. Now, also, to build on this, Rhaena's parents, Aenys and Alyssa, didn't want this to happen either. But if you think about it, it's a very quick fix to the whole situation here. How do you combine the two, right? You marry Maegor to Rhaena. Now, we know actually this does eventually happen later on in the story, but this for right now would have actually fixed the succession, even though it doesn't really come in any... It doesn't actually impact anything, but at this point, that would have been a quick solution. So instead, the Faith, who has grown more and more powerful under Aenys' reign, they are basically like, you know, Maegor, how about instead you marry Cersei Hightower? Now, this is interesting, because in all of these succession crises, Hightowers are always involved. It's very interesting, because the Hightowers are trying to gain power from this situation. And what I think is interesting here is that they pick the side that realistically would have more power. If say Aenys does not have a son, which we know he end up does, he has multiple, but in this situation, if Aenys was to not have a son and say die, Maegor has become one of the finer warriors at this point in the Seven Kingdoms. He has a Valyrian sword, Dark Sister, and is trying to get Balerion the Black Dread. It's a very interesting idea, right? So, how would that have worked? And I think the Hightowers were setting themselves up to be in a very powerful position. Just didn't end up going the way they wanted to, and I think they underestimated who Maegor was as a person. But in 25 AC, they were married. So this is this is basically when Maegor is 13, when he gets Dark Sister. So a lot of things happen. When Maegor is 13, he gets married, he gets a Valyrian sword. A lot of shit happens for Maegor when he is 13. Now, Maegor famously says that he got Cersei with child the night of their wedding, and that was left to be unseen. As we'll see later on in the story, she does not get pregnant at all. In their whole entire marriage, she just doesn't get pregnant, and that will spark some controversy with Maegor's move in his later years. Now, what Maegor failed with reproducing, he very much triumphed in military combat. So in 28 AC, he won a renowned tourney by defeating 3 knights of the Kingsguard in a joust, and next winning the melee. This is incredible for such a young man, where Maegor is only 16. This is very reminiscent to Jaime, because at this point, Aegon knights Maegor. This is actually the youngest knight in the realm, right? So Maegor becomes a knight at the age of 16. Extremely young. It shows you his prowess at swordplay, jousting, really everything. And it again shows why people loved Maegor early in his reign, and especially as he was growing up, because he was somebody that was very competent and was the exact opposite of Aenys when Aenys comes into power later on. Now, in both 29 AC and 30 AC, Maegor assisted the Master of Ships Lord Aethan Velaryon and the Hand of the King Sir Osmond Strong in 2 campaigns against the Pirate King Saragossa San in the Stepstones, and in 31 AC defeated the Giant of the Trident. So again, I want to point out a lot of similarities between Daemon and Maegor at this point. Daemon and Maegor both were characters that were great sword fighters, and what do they do to show and build their reputation when it kind of seems in doubt because of Aenys having children? They go on military campaigns. They build up their reputation in the Seven Kingdoms, and they specifically go to the Stepstones, and both characters defeat 2 main antagonists. So you have the Giant of the Stepstones, or the Giant of the Trident, and you also have the Crab Feeder of the Stepstones with Daemon. So, again, a lot of similarities that we see with Maegor in other characters later on in the story during the Dance of the Dragons, and that's something I wanted to bring up. And that will conclude kind of Maegor's early life, and the next part of Maegor's life we'll kind of talk about after Aegon dies, and in Aenys' rule, and how Maegor goes about doing certain actions that will lead him into exile. So getting into the next part of Maegor's life, as I talked about before, Aegon will die in the year 37 AC. Now this will mark Aenys coming to the throne, and what's interesting is a lot of things happen very quickly here for Maegor, where Maegor attends his father's funeral, and the sword Blackfire is given to Maegor by his brother Aenys, and Aenys basically tells Maegor, and the public as a whole, that they will rule together. Now this is a good sentiment, but let's think about this right now. Not only does Maegor already have Dark Sister, he also now has Blackfire, so he's in control of both of the Targaryen Valyrian swords. And as we'll see, shortly after Aegon's death, Maegor claims Balerion the Black Dread. So he has the most powerful dragon. His mother controls the second most powerful dragon. He has both of the Valyrian swords of the Targaryen family. Maegor has almost all of the power of House Targaryen at such a young age already. And how has he been given these things, and why has he been able to claim these things? Well, we look at his violence in the wars prior that we see in 29 AC and 30 AC. We see that he has been patient and is waiting for Balerion when his father dies. It's something that's very similar to Aemond and how he claims Vhagar later on, where Aemond he wasn't planning on this, but he basically waits until after Laena dies and then claims Vhagar. So, moving on after this, we will see that Maegor right away starts using Balerion. He's not idle, so we have this whole idea that Aenys and Maegor are very different. Aenys is very slow to action. He is someone that really tries to think about everything, and to the degree he overthinks things. So there's rebellions going on all over the place, right? So just to name one of them, in the Vale, Jonas Arryn rose up against his brother Lord Ronald, imprisoning him and his family. And even though Maegor was a little late on arriving to rescue Lord Ronald, Maegor personally crushes this rebellion, flying on Balerion to the Eyrie. Jonas's followers believed, well, if we get rid of Jonas and throw him through the moon door, that maybe they would be spared. They didn't really know who Maegor was as a person. And Maegor had them all hanged, which, again, this is one of those things where people will say that Maegor was cruel. This is very much justified. These people were committing treason, and the punishment for treason is usually death, and Maegor gave them death. So again, I don't think I have any problems with this. A lot of people would point to this as being another moment of him being cruel, but this is what just needed to be done, and Aenys was not the man to do it. And also to replace Lord Alan Stokeworth, who had died fighting another rebellion, King Aenys I named Maegor as his new Hand of the King to reward him for his service. Now, Maegor would only hold the Hand of the King for about 2 years, but this is something I want to talk about here, is why Maegor starts to gain popularity. Aenys, think about it like this way, is letting these rebellions happen and is sitting on his butt doing nothing, okay? And Maegor is out here actively solving issues, right? And becoming the person that I think a lot of people would compare to Aegon. I think if you look at the two of them, they are both the extreme personalities of Aegon. And I think a lot of people for this moment see much more of Aegon and Maegor than they do of Aenys. And that just becomes apparent when you have Maegor having Aegon's dragon and his sword and Visenya's sword. There's a lot here that points to why Maegor gets such a following early on in his life. Now, what's interesting is that by 39 AC, so this is about 2 years after Aegon has died, Maegor and his first wife, Cersei Hightower, still do not have a child. This has been 14 years after they've been married. And I think this is something that we look back on Maegor, and it's clear to see that he was the one that was probably not fertile. But at this point of his life, right, he needs an heir, right? It's very apparent he needs an heir. That's a very important thing for the Targaryens. And to this point, Maegor is getting older, right? Maegor, at this point of his life, is now 27. He's kind of getting up there in age. You know, he's starting to get a little worried, and it's very weird that he would have no children by this point. So what Maegor tries to do is he announces that Cersei was barren and that he should be able to take another wife. And we understand Maegor why he's doing this for a lot of reasons, because one, he feels like he is justified in doing something like this because he is the dragon. That some of the Targaryens believe that they are basically above normal humans, which gave them the right to do things that other humans should not be able to do. And this was something that definitely went into Maegor's decision, where the Faith tries to rule over the Targaryens quite a lot in Aenys' reign. And this is something that Maegor definitely was against. And Maegor had reasoning here. I think Maegor, to me, I understand his reasoning. Even though, like, if you look at our standards now, this is not acceptable. But when you look at the Targaryens and the time period, this makes a lot of sense. So Maegor more or less gets another wife. He gets Lady Alice Harroway, and he tries to convince the Septon at Dragonstone to perform the wedding, and he refuses. So what ends up happening is what we see with kind of Rhaenyra and Daemon, where they do a Valyrian wedding ceremony led by Visenya Targaryen. Now, this marriage angers a ton of people, because you have to remember at this point, the Faith was growing in power against Aenys, and we were leading towards a rebellion that will eventually kick off later on. And it's a very uneasy point. If we see even later when Jaehaerys and Alysanne marry, the Faith is still really pissed off about that. So at this point, it's even worse, because at this point, the Faith were armed and they could have their own rebellion. This is just something else that pisses them off. And it's something where Aenys takes the Faith side of it, trying to prevent war. Now, it's very interesting because Maegor and the Targaryens as a whole can wipe out the Faith pretty easily, right? But you have to understand how to do that and to put fear in them, which is something Jaehaerys was able to do very well. Something Maegor was never able to balance out. He basically just wipes out the Faith, more or less, at this point. Well, not at this point, later on. But now, the High Septon at this point denounces the marriage, of course, as sin and fornication, and calls Alice the whore of Harroway. Now, it's a very interesting claim, because Aegon, as we remember, had two wives as well. He had his sisters in Rhaenys and Visenya, and no one really bats an eye at this, and nobody really raises a finger. People even offer him a third wife when he's first coming over trying to make alliances. So we look at the difference here of people, especially the Faith, don't respect and or fear Maegor at this point, where they think that they can just rule over people like Maegor, and that's just something that's never going to happen. And Maegor even defends him. Maegor even basically states that the Faith did not rule the blood of the dragon, which is very true. When you have the power of the dragon, what are the Faith really going to do to you? So we understand where Maegor is kind of coming from. Now, Aenys is pretty much furious of this, and he gives Maegor a choice. Set Alice aside or go into exile for 5 years. And Maegor, being kind of the defiant person he is, and someone that doesn't really want to back down from his actions, chooses to go into exile. And he leaves in 40 AC for Pentos with Alice and Balerion. He also takes the sword Blackfire with him, which was not very popular with Aenys. Aenys wanted him to leave the sword behind. And just like that, you have really the powerful force for the Targaryens gone. And with that being said, in 41 AC, Aenys names his son Prince Aegon, Prince of Dragonstone. Now, this will lead us to really what we see with a lot of the rebellions going on, especially the Faith. So what's interesting here is that, yes, Aenys goes with the Faith and goes against his brother, but not 1 year later, the Faith rise up against King Aenys in 41 AC. So in 42 AC, about a year after the rebellion starts, Aenys dies on Dragonstone. Now, this is a very bad time for him to die. As we see, Rhaena and Aegon, his eldest daughter and son, are besieged at Crakehall, and after Aenys is burned, so basically, he's passed on, Visenya flies to Pentos on the back of her dragon Vhagar to bring Maegor back to Westeros. Now, we obviously know what's going to happen here, where Visenya is going to get her son so that he can become the new king of Westeros. It's very obvious, and it makes a lot of sense, right? Maegor is old enough to be a king at this point. He has all of the Targaryen things that make you a king. He has the biggest dragon. He has the swords. He has the look. He has the claim. Everything is setting up perfectly for Maegor in this moment. And it only gets worse for Aenys' children. Now, what we see here is when Maegor gets back, he instantly claims the Iron Throne, right? He was crowned a Dragonstone, and not with Aenys' crown, but with Aegon's crown. Now, this is seen as a big power move, because, like we've talked about, Maegor much more resembles Aegon than Aenys ever did. So, what this is going to do is show the people that Maegor is the closest resemblance to Aegon, and after all of these years of bad rule by Aenys, he's one of the worst Targaryen kings in history. People want someone that's a little bit more cruel almost, but not really cruel. I would say more of direct and fixing the problems and actually taking action. People are applauding that at this point. If we want to talk about a good comparison, so if we look at World War II and the build-up to World War II, the people of Germany were in a place where they were hungry, they were beaten down, they had lost a lot of their pride after World War I, and someone like a Hitler comes along and is promising you pride, is promising building up your military, making you all of these promises. That is kind of what I think about when I think about with Maegor, where because of what happens before, inherently benefits Maegor. If we had had someone like Jaehaerys ruling right before Maegor, this probably wouldn't have stood. The people would have been against Maegor. But because of how bad of a job his brother Aenys did, it allows Maegor to really gain a lot of the support of the common people. Now, again, with all of the laws of Westeros, the crown should have passed to Aegon, but it doesn't. This is one of those situations where Maegor just had more power right now. If we look at Aegon, again, he is still being besieged, basically, at Crakehall. So, again, this is one of those situations where Maegor just had perfect timing. Now, also, we see that Gawain, who is the Grand Maester at this time, refutes basically Maegor becoming king, and Maegor takes his head off. So a little bit, I'd say a lot cruel, someone disagreeing with you and you instantly take their head off. But I think we really have to look at understanding why Maegor hates the faith so much, because this will not be the first time he does this. He does this 2 more times. I think we have to look at the idea here that the faith is an open rebellion. The faith has done nothing but criticize Maegor. The faith has never been friends with Maegor. So of course Maegor is going to be this person that's telling him, oh yeah, you can't do this, you can't do that. And it's just how Maegor's been grown up, where Maegor's had a lot of things handed to him. Even though he has worked for a lot of his things like his swordplay, he's worked at that for years. He's been having people tell him he can't do this, can't do that by the faith his entire life. And that will go to show a lot of his motivations towards the faith in his rule. Now, what we see is Maegor takes his mother, and they all go to King's Landing to kind of take the Iron Throne. Now, what's interesting here is that the faith has actually taken over a bit of the city. So when Maegor actually reaches King's Landing, he finds that the faith has seized the Sept of Remembrance on Rhaenys Hill. And this becomes an interesting idea where Visenya and Maegor basically say, anyone that refutes my claim to the throne, come forth. And Sir Daemon Morgan, the Grand Captain of the Warrior Sons, so this is the fighters of the faith, came forth. And Maegor quickly decides, all right, we're going to deal with this with swords the way I've always done it, with violence. And Daemon demands a trial of 7, to which Maegor agrees. Now, Maegor actually didn't have any Kingsguard here, or any of his loyal, knights. So basically, he just asked the crowd, who wants to help me fight against these people? And a number of people come forth, and eventually this trial by 7 happens, and Maegor wins. Now, Maegor does not come out of this unscathed. He basically gets hit and goes into kind of a deep coma. He is in this coma for 30 days until Tiana of the Tower takes over his care and he wakes up. Now, what this did for the Faith is it put a little bit of question marks in them, because now it's like, well, Maegor did win the trial and the gods were on his side. So do we back him as king? Or others insisted that they were bound by oath to follow the High Septon and fight on. So it's a very interesting idea that Maegor has already caused a little bit of confusion and dissent within the Faith. And that will be something that he will build upon once he starts dealing with the Faith. And did Maegor deal with the Faith? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. He mounts Balerion right after waking up and flies directly to Rainey's Hill and basically burns the Sept of Remembrance. And his archers kill everybody else that tries to flee the Inferno. This is not all that happens to the Faith militant. That same year, Maegor's forces achieved victory over the Faith militant in a battle at Stonebridge, and later in a battle of the Fork of the Black Water. Now, following these two victories, Maegor is basically found a new, I guess, confidence, and or has shown the Faith that he does not fear them, and that he can deal with them whenever he would like. And he marries again, taking Tiana of the Tower as his third wife. So he now has 3 wives. One of his wives isn't actually with him right now, his first one, who is a High Tower. She is actually back in Old Town. And again, another Grand Maester, Grand Maester Myros, objects to this, and that Maegor says that Maegor's one true wife is in Old Town, right? And what does Maegor do? Kills him. So again, we see this idea that Maegor does not take shit from people. If you tell Maegor no, you better have some way of enforcing that, because that's just not Maegor. Maegor is one of those people where you tell him not to do something, he will then go and do it, more or less. Very similar to Aemond Targaryen. Now, something that I think a lot of people overlook during Maegor's rule, but Maegor basically finishes the Red Keep. He makes a holdfast within the Red Keep, known as Maegor's Holdfast. So Maegor is responsible for completing a lot of these things, which are very positive to his name. And it's going to be something we're going to tackle in this video, is, was Maegor really a cruel person? And what good did he do for the realm? And this is definitely an inherently good thing that he does for the realm. He secures the castle a bit more and furthers its progress that Jaehaerys will build upon after Maegor. But another thing I want to talk about is that we see a lot throughout history that you can only rule with fear for so long. Once the people realize that they're being held down by your rule and the fear kind of goes away, where people have really nothing left to live for, or they've been treated so poorly that they start to revolt. We see this multiple times, whether that's through the French Revolution, whether that's through, hell, you can even go at the Russian Revolution during World War I, which lets them turn to communism. There is a lot of times where fear can only get you so far. And that's kind of how I feel about Maegor, where he was someone that definitely ruled with more fear and brutality than with love or compassion, or mixing both of those, which is what Jaehaerys was able to do afterwards. So this will kind of start Maegor's reign, and we'll see how he rules. Now, another thing that's interesting to talk about here is that Maegor actually builds secret tunnels for the Targaryens, and also builds 4 levels of dungeons. Now, some of these dungeons were actually used for torment specifically. Now, this may not be a fact, as there maybe is some evidence to suggest maybe this was something the Maesters came up to smear Maegor, but I do think that was his intent, personally. I mean, you can kind of go either way with that one, but I think there is evidence to suggest that Maegor did use those for torment. And what ends up happening is he has all these builders building all these secret tunnels in the Red Keep as a whole, and then he kills them all. So for people that like to argue that Maegor was kind of justified, this is one of those situations where I very much disagree. where I understand why Maegor's doing it, because he doesn't want all of the secrets of the Targaryens getting out. But at the same time, did you really need to kill everyone? Like, it seems very harsh and a little bit too far, in my opinion. Like, in my opinion, if you're going to have these secret tunnels and all this, just have a couple and then have one person that you trust doing them, I guess. But to me, yeah, it seems a little bit too far, in my opinion. Now, in early 43 AC, Lord Lucas Harroway, so this is the father of his wife Alice, he becomes the Hand, and he is kind of really the one ruling the kingdoms at this point, where Maegor's worried about the Red Keep, Maegor's Holdfast, these secret patches, as we've talked about, and he's just more worried about war in general and putting down the faith. And what follows with the whole struggle with the faith is Maegor basically sets into law these religious people cannot have weapons, they have to be disarmed, and anyone that goes against these, any lords that spoke out against these laws, the suppression of the faith, would be punished. And what really happens is Maegor allows the faith and the High Septon to continue doing what they're doing for a little while. And what follows is Visenya and Maegor just basically go out into the Reach in the Westerlands, and any of these houses who had defied his royal summons or were speaking out were burned. And this isn't extreme, but at the same time, I think this is justified. You know, we talk about a lot of cruelties with Maegor and how he gets the name of Maegor the Cruel, but this is one of those times where this is exactly what Aegon does. Now, maybe Maegor could have tried to reach out one more time, maybe giving them an option right before he kills them that, hey, bend the knee or else you're going to die. But at this point, I really understand why Maegor does this. He has to show that he is serious. Like, if you do not bend the knee or come when I call you, this is what your fate will happen. And Jaehaerys does this in a better way, I think, but I understand why he does this. So again, I will not condemn him for his actions here. I think this is morally justified for the most part. Now, what comes next is Maegor and Visenya had every intention, as they're going towards Old Town, to basically burn down the Starry Sept in response to the High Septons condemning his marriages and him as a king as a whole. And a very convenient thing happens. So I think right here is probably where I think Martin Hightower probably killed the old High Septon. It's just very convenient that the old High Septon dies right when Visenya and Maegor are coming, and the new High Septon is way more passive and is willing to accept Maegor. So I think, honestly, I think this is another little bit of Hightower meddling, and they even turn against their own in this situation. But again, this is a good action by Martin Hightower, because if he doesn't do this, Old Town probably would have been burnt to a crisp. So what ends up happening is Maegor and Visenya get there. They find the gates basically wide open. And the new High Septon basically has no real power here. Like, what's he going to do? And he just lets Maegor send all of these warrior sons to the wall or be executed. And Maegor kind of stays at Old Town for a little while, proceeding over trials of people that wronged him or may not have wronged him, and also adding to his earlier laws. He actually starts to place bounties on the heads of the faithful who remain defiant. So again, all of these actions are justified, right? If we look at any point of history, rebelling against the crown is punishable by death. And Maegor gave every indication to these people that, hey, if you stick on this side, you're going to die. I mean, they were basically going against the law that Maegor had put in place. And again, I think this is all justified. And I want to even talk about how Maegor, in reality, saves the Targaryens. Because, yes, this is a very bloody conflict that Maegor is going through with taking down the faith. But it's something that needed to happen. And I think this was inevitable, that we were going to see some sort of conflict between the Targaryens and the faith. And I think this is really the event that really starts the plotting of taking down the dragons. Because if you think about what the faith were doing in this whole time, they really had no chance of beating the Targaryens. And I think Maegor all of his sins that we've seen him create early in his life and even up to now and even later, this is one of those times where if you're, a Targaryen fan or you're in the Targaryen family, you look at Maegor and he did save the Targaryen dynasty. I mean, the Targaryen dynasty at this point was very, very unstable outside of Visenya and Maegor. And they really bring resolution to all of the rebellions that were going on in Aenys' reign. Now, the only misstep that Maegor does do here is that instead of just serving one of these other people, it should be Aegon, Aenys' son, he takes the throne, and that causes Targaryen infighting, which is something we'll see will be the next part of Maegor's life. This first part's kind of been about his growing up and his struggle with the faith. And now that plot kind of gets concluded, and now we see fighting against really his own family and how this will start to turn him as a person. And another thing I want to mention about Old Town that I think is very important to note is that Maegor reconciles with his queen, Cersei Hightower, so that was his first wife, for you guys that don't remember, and they celebrate their reunion with a great feast, and they had a second consummation, and she returns to King's Landing. So now, Maegor has 3 wives in King's Landing currently, and he is still yet to have a child. So at this point, I think any rational person should just understand that Maegor was probably infertile. He was not producing any children through 3 different women. It's highly, highly unlikely that they were all barren, especially when he was sleeping with them as much as he was, or were at least told he was. At this point, there's that idea that he probably was infertile. Now, there's an interesting idea here that I think House of the Dragon kind of nods at, is that people that seem like they are morally on the evil side of things struggle to have children. Aemond is someone that we don't know if he ever has a child. There is this child that's brought up by his mistress at Harrenhal. We're not sure if that's actually his child, but again, he never has an actual legitimate child throughout his life. Daemon's an interesting case because Daemon does have a lot of children, but it is interesting where I think there's this parallel that people that are more morally bad have issues with reproduction or sex as a whole, which I think is a little interesting tidbit to throw in here. So during this same year, it's a bit later in the year, Prince Aegon, Aenys' oldest son, this would be the older brother of Jaehaerys, announces his claim to the Iron Throne. Now, he was supported by a couple houses, several lords from the Westerlands and the Riverlands, and marches with about 15,000 men. What I think is really interesting here is that Aegon is very naive here. Aegon is going against the 2 greatest dragons at this point. There's no way he's going to win this battle. And we see a lot of this of naivety from people where I don't know if they're honor bound or they believe, Aegon is the rightful leader, right? Or the king of Westeros. But he needs to realize the situation. There is no situation where he comes out on top. And we see just that, right? So what Maegor ends up doing is he basically gathers all of his forces. He's informed by his queen, Tyanna. She is basically the mistress of whisperers. And what I think is interesting here is that what Aegon is trying to do and what this battle will decide is that if Maegor loses this battle, House Baratheon, Aeron Stark, and Lannister were all considering joining Aegon's side. And what I think is the big factor here is that Maegor is much more experienced. He has the swords of House Targaryen. He has the 2 greatest dragons. Everything points to Maegor winning this. And I think that's what keeps a lot of the greater houses out of this war to begin with. Now, in the battle beneath the God's Eye, the forces kind of go at it, but it's just one of those things where Aegon's dragon, Quicksilver, was no match for Balerion the Black Dread and Maegor. And from this point on, Maegor becomes known as Maegor the Cruel and a kinslayer throughout the realm. Now, what I think is very interesting, this is not the moment that I would have said that Maegor was cruel. Aegon is the one that actively marches an army towards Maegor, And what is Maegor going to do? Right? Like, Maegor is put into a situation where he knew this was probably going to happen by taking the throne. But Aegon basically does a suicide march into him. And it's not like a situation like Aemond, where Aemond kills Luke, and it's more just like anger, and Aemond actively wants to kill him. It's one of those things where I think Maegor probably would have been fine if Aegon just didn't try that. If Aegon had bent the knee, I don't think Maegor would have had any problems. But when you have a battle and it's two brothers going, or not two brothers, but it's like when you have an uncle going against, your brother's kid, it's an interesting concept, and I don't think that is the moment I would have said Maegor is the cruel. I think you could have pointed to many other different points where you have Maegor doing things that are much more cruel and that just are not needed, whereas this was needed for Maegor. He had to win this battle. His whole claim to the throne was staked on this battle. Now, the next part of Maegor's plan is to make Aenys' widow, Alyssa Velaryon, and her two youngest children, Jaehaerys and Alysanne. They are pretty famous. If you guys don't know them, they will become the king and queen after all the events happen here. And they make basically them Visenya's wards on Dragonstone, and then also summons her son Viserys to court, making him his personal squire. And again, we see the idea of Maegor needs an heir come up once again. But it seems, for a time, that Maegor has finally got his wish when Queen Alyce announced that she was pregnant that year. And what happens is not good. When she goes into labor, only 3 months later after the announcement, she gives birth to a monstrosity that's twisted. It's not human. And Maegor, in his arrogance and his pride, says this could not be his child, right? And he basically kills everyone involved in the birthing of this child outside of Alyce's two sisters. That is much more cruelty than a battle that we saw later on. And this is just something where it's just so unnecessary. And if Maegor really took a step back and just looked at himself, he would understand that it probably was not his wife's fault or anybody helping give birth. And what's interesting here now is that Queen Tyanna, now I mentioned her a little bit before, is this kind of mistress of whispers, and she basically says that someone else got Alyce pregnant. And this basically sets Maegor off, and he probably had a bunch of dudes that were basically tormented and held under captivity, and they all claim, well, most of them claim to have slept with her. And Maegor, again, with his pride and looking for a way out, or has Alyce dragged from her bed and given to Tyanna to torture her. Now, I would assume for Tyanna, this was more about her probably being jealous of Alyce because of, again, another woman, and also the idea that he could get another queen out of the battle. She gains power out of this entire situation, and Maegor falls for it because, again, it's a good alibi to, oh, it's not Maegor's fault. It can't be. I'm a big Targaryen guy. It's got to be somebody else's fault. And it doesn't go well. So basically, Alyce's father, Lucas Haraway, is killed. Alyce's death happening as well. And Maegor then kills off the entire Haraway family as they were positioned at Harrenhal at this point. And there was a lot of other things that happen with Harrenhal on who gets it, which isn't really important to this video. But basically, he stages a tournament to decide who will get Harrenhal directly after he slaughtered an entire line of people based off of one woman's whispers that probably weren't even true. So that is why Maegor is known as Maegor the Cruel. Not because of things like up here where he kills Aegon when Aegon was the one marching towards Maegor. And that, I think there's a lot of misconceptions around Maegor, where Maegor does do a lot of good for the Targaryens, but he also does a ton of bad, and he's just a terrible king for the most part. When it comes to dealing with people and outside of like war, he's terrible. He just like, how much more do I need to explain that he kills off an entire family? And yeah, so let's move on. We're moving on, and when Maegor returns to King's Landing, he realizes and finds out that his mother, Queen Visenya, has died. The last of the big three has finally departed. Now, this news devastates Maegor, which, again, makes a lot of sense. Visenya was very close to Maegor. Maegor was close to her. And Visenya really was Maegor's main parent. I feel like Aegon was not a good parent to Maegor. And it makes a lot of sense why he kind of starts to deteriorate after this moment. And losing Vhagar, again, because now Vhagar does not have a rider, is a huge blow to Maegor. It puts even more of the weight and pressure of ruling the realm on his shoulders. And what even gets worse is that in the confusion of her death, Alyssa Velaryon and her two children, Jaehaerys and Alysanne, also taking the sword, Dark Sister, with her, escape Dragonstone. Now, this is a very ballsy move because, again, I talked about earlier that Prince Viserys, who is also one of Alyssa Velaryon's children, is arrested and tortured. Viserys is tortured for 9 days of questioning by Queen Tyanna, and then eventually dies. His mutilated body was left in the courtyard for a fortnight in an unsuccessful attempt to force Alyssa to return. Now, this is a really stupid move, in my opinion, because you're holding a hostage for a reason, right? So if they look to attack, they start marching, that's when you parade Viserys out. Don't kill him now. So to me, that was a very stupid move. And again, I don't blame Maegor in this situation for killing Viserys. That is what Viserys' job was, right? Having him close and in King's Landing, he was there basically like Theon was, where Ned always thought he would probably have to kill Theon at some point, which is why he tried not to get close to him. Unfortunately, that was Viserys. He was basically sentenced to die if his mother or his siblings did anything against Maegor. That was his fate. And that's how Westeros had been functioning at this point. Wards were a thing. And if you broke that, that's what happened. And Alyssa Velaryon knew the cost of that. So, again, I don't blame Maegor for that, but torturing the poor kid and killing him in a way that really didn't make any sense. Like, he should have waited until there actually was some sort of plot against him. I thought that was really stupid, in my opinion. And I don't know. Let me know what you guys think on that idea. So, in 45 AC, the Red Keep is actually completed. And again, as we've seen, I mentioned earlier in this video, Maegor throws a feast, and after 3 days of this feasting, he kills all the workers. He puts them all to death, and he has their bones basically put underneath the castle that they had built. It's a very sad and tragic death for these builders that spent their time building something that was magnificent to then be killed directly after it. Now, Maegor next orders the construction of the dragon pits, or the dragon pit for the Targaryen dragons at the site of the ruined Sept of Remembrance on Rhaenys Hill. So again, Maegor was very fond of building things. As we see, he is all kind of about that. But again, let's go through Maegor's thought process here. Let's build something else. Maegor, you just killed all the builders. Like, sometimes Maegor just doesn't think, in my opinion. Like, he does such incredible violence, and then when boom, obviously there's no builders left to build this dragon pit. And then the people that like just saw you killing all of the dudes that just built the Red Keep, who is going to work for you? I just thought that was really funny to talk about. And the King Maegor ends up using prisoners instead, which yeah, that really seems like his only option at this point. Now, another interesting rumor pops up about Maegor's first wife. So Maegor's first wife, Cersei Hightower, ends up actually dying at this point. And there's a lot of rumors around this, that maybe she said something to Maegor, and that Owen Bush of the Kingsguard was sent to remove her tongue, and maybe he missed and slashed her throat instead. We just don't know, and I am personally of the idea that this probably never happened. I think Cersei Hightower probably just died because she was ill. I think that makes sense, and I think this was something that, again, the Maesters kind of padded on to make Maegor more cruel than he probably was in that situation. And this is the point where Maegor loses the people. And I think it's where people just become too fed up with his cruelty. His war is costing the kingdom way too much money at this point. The wars have just been going on. Like, think about it at this point. There has not been peace in the Seven Kingdoms since Aegon the First's reign. And even then, it was littered through with rebellions in his reign as well. So what I'm talking about here is in 45 AC, the same year that the Red Keep is completed, Maegor takes flight again, and he goes down to hunt the poor fellows who had taken refuge at the Great Woods south of the Blackwater. He then kills about 2,000 people. Now, it is widely believed, apparently by the Maesters in their recounting, that a lot of the victims had been innocent small folk. Now, I don't know if I believe that. I think this is probably another point where the Maesters probably are inflating this number. I don't doubt that there were some small folk who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, but you can't sit here and tell me, oh, a bunch of religious folk that are taking up arms against the crown, and you're just in this area. Like, what did you think was going to... Why would you stay next to these people? Unless you were helping them along some way. So, personally, I would say Maegor probably killed mostly people that were breaking the law under his rule and treated them as treasonous people, which they were. So, again, I don't have too many issues with Maegor hunting down the poor fellows, and maybe there were a couple innocents that's a tragedy to, have them die, but that's just kind of what happens in war, and it's just something you have to accept in this world as a reality, which is terrible, and it should probably never happen, but I don't think we can condemn Maegor for these actions when we've seen far worse from him and other kings as well. Now, again, like I said, the treasury at this point is really struggling. So the current Master of Coin, Lord Alton Butterwell, has to continuously raise taxes and imposing new ones, and these eventually, even they fail. And Maegor demands a tribute of gold from the High Lords. And this, again, it breaks the small folk. It breaks a lot of the relationship with Maegor, where Maegor is allowed to be cruel when the kingdom's doing well, and it's not affecting the average person too much. But when you're seeing it constantly, the brutality, the cruelness of Maegor, and you're having taxes in the economy of Westeros just plummet, you understand why people turn their backs on Maegor and why a rebellion is able to happen later on in the story. And we flip to 45 AC or 47 AC, where the whole idea of the Black Bride starts. And you guys got to remember now, so at this point, Queen Tyanna is the only queen left. His first wife had died, and his other wife has also died at this point. And most of his counselors, surprisingly, actually told him he does need to remarry. Again, Maegor needs heirs. It is a major plot point we see with the Targaryens all the time. And in 47 AC, Maegor does something just crazy. Whereas before, maybe we could rationalize, okay, well, Aegon had 2 wives, his sister wives, and, he wasn't seeing any children early on. Maybe one of his wives was barren. Fair enough. But in 47 AC, he marries not 1, not 2, 3 women at the same time. He marries Princess Rhaena, who he's related to, Jane Westerling, shout out to Jane Westerling from the normal story, and Eleanor Costain. And these women become known as the Black Brides. Now, we have an interesting idea here, is that Queen Jane and also Lady Eleanor become pregnant. So, okay, interesting. Maegor has not been able to have children for a while, and now two women all of a sudden have children. But, as we've seen with previous pregnancies, like Alice's, Jane goes into labor much earlier before her due date and gives birth to a stillborn child who was legless and armless and had both male and female genitalia, it is said. Now, Maegor then has Queen Tyanna seized and delivers her to the dungeons. Now, this is where I think is interesting. She confesses to having both poisoned Alice's child as Jane's, and that Eleanor's would be the same. I don't know if I believe this, because we've seen already that Maegor has not been able to have children with a lot of his other wives on multiple encounters where he was sleeping with a different woman every night. I personally think it is actually just Maegor could not have children. And I think that's what George wanted us to take away from that. But maybe this is possible. We don't know, because it's very odd the way the circumstances happen, where I think it was just Queen Tyanna getting back at Maegor because she knew her life was forfeit at this point. And also, she was about to be tortured She's going to be tortured anyway to say these things regardless, so why not say them before getting tortured and then she'd be killed? To me, I just don't trust Queen Tyanna's words at the point she gives them to really suggest she actually did these things. To be fair, Tyanna was right. Eleanor goes into labor in early 40 AC and births an eyeless child with small wings. So again, we see that something just isn't going right. Right? Maegor cannot have children. He's basically producing monsters at this point. And I think we can kind of see why this drives Maegor insane. He is someone that has lost his mother, can't reproduce. He has people plotting all around him to bring him down. The small folk hate him at this point. And again, he's brought a lot of this onto himself. Don't get me wrong. But Maegor has really nothing to lose at this point, and that's what I'm trying to build upon. And what happens after this is really the downfall of Maegor, where, like I said earlier, where all that fear and cruelty, well, you can't rule like that forever. The tide starts to shift, and a new person challenges Maegor by the name of Jaehaerys Targaryen. So, like I mentioned, 48 AC is where, at Storm's End, Prince Jaehaerys puts forth his claim to the Iron Throne, supported by Lord Rhaegar Baratheon, who is named Protector of the Realm and Hand of the King for Jaehaerys. Now, at this point, Jaehaerys had two dragons on his side, Vermithor and his sister's mount Silverwing against Maegor's Balerion. Now, I would still argue Maegor had the advantage. If we're looking at just dragons, Maegor had the advantage. If we're talking about armies, Jaehaerys definitely had the advantage. But if Maegor used Balerion correctly, he could quite easily probably kill both of their dragons. But to add to their two dragons, Queen Rhaena Targaryen, one of the Black Brides, also flees from Maegor in the night and adds her own dragon, Dreamfire, to the mix, as well as the Valyrian blade, Blackfire. And again, I want to talk about the meddling of the Hightowers. So at this point, Prince Rhaella, Rhaena's daughter, was actually at Old Town and had been sent there kind of as another ward. And because of Rhaena's betrayal, House Hightower was to kill Rhaella. And the Hightowers stay pretty quiet. They don't move this way or that, and they kind of just keep her as a prisoner and don't do anything. And they're very much waiting on who is going to win the war, is more or less what I see here. Everyone at this point starts to desert Maegor. People, again, don't like Maegor. They're afraid of really talking to Maegor at all and giving him hard advice. If we look at someone like Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin, no one was willing to tell them no, or we can't do this, or we need to do something else, because they were afraid for their lives. They were afraid of losing power or position. And that is very much what happens here to Maegor, where everyone just deserts him. Some people go to Pentos, others, in the Kingsguard specifically, desert him. His admiral of the royal fleet, Daemon Velaryon, they abandon him. And also the great houses, Lannisters, Tyrells, Arryns, and even the Riverlands, House Tully gave support to Septon Moon and Sir Joffrey Duggat, the leaders of the Portfellas. So everyone at this point has turned against Maegor. Maegor really has nothing left. Maegor calls his banners, but really no one answers. He has an army of about 4,000. And what I'm trying to say here is that I think Maegor, if he was not going to die on the Iron Throne, still possibly could have won. Again, Balerion is much bigger, much older than the dragons that we see on the other side, so it's still possible. But sadly, well, I guess not sadly for the people of Westeros, we never see that outcome. We never see that play out and how that could have happened. And again, like I was just talking about, how nobody could really give Maegor honest counsel, Lord Hayford suggests that Maegor abdicate and take the Black. And you know what Maegor did? Ordered him beheaded and continued his war council with Lord Hayford's head mounted on a lance behind the Iron Throne. So here's the idea here, is that no one was able to ever counsel Maegor. Maegor could not take advice, and that was his undoing, and it was something that he did not do well. If again, we look at someone like Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin ends up dying because he basically kills all the other doctors, right? So it's one of those situations where Maegor has really condemned himself at this point, and he really has no friends left. Now, after this war council to kind of figure out what they're going to do, Maegor remains alone in the Iron Throne to brood. And he was found dead the next morning by Queen Eleanor, seated on the Iron Throne with his robes covered in black and his wrists slashed. Now, there's many interpretations of what happened here. We don't know actually how Maegor died. There is an idea that maybe the throne killed him, as there was a spike from one of the swords on the throne behind him was impaled through the back of his neck. We just don't know. Some say he had been killed by Queen Eleanor, others that he had been killed by a knight of his own Kingsguard, yet others say that he had been killed by a builder who escaped the slaughter 3 years earlier and desired revenge. I feel like that one's very far-fetched. Maybe Maegor kills himself. And I would like to probably think that that one is not true. I don't think Maegor would have killed himself. If we look at how we've studied Maegor throughout his entire life, he was someone that was never willing to give up. Whether that's a good or bad thing, he was someone that was never going to take no for an answer. And I look at Maegor as a person that, yes, he went through a ton of issues, especially late in his reign, and the world was stacked against him at this point, but I don't think it was in his character to take his own life. I think if Maegor wanted to go out, he would have gone out with Balerion fighting for his throne, and I think that's the way I pictured Maegor going out, if that is truly how he wanted to die, if he wanted to even die at all. So what I believe probably happened is, again, I don't know how he would have been killed by Queen Eleanor. I don't know how that would have worked. I don't know if if suggesting that by the Maesters is that somehow she overpowered him, that wouldn't have happened. I think it's probably likely that if Queen Eleanor was involved, which could be the case, she had help. And I think that probably could be a knight of his own Kingsguard again. Would be very reminiscent to the Mad King, where maybe Maegor's plans was to unleash Balerion on the rebel forces and the chaos and death that would cause, and maybe even the ending of the House Targaryen as a whole. Maybe the Kingsguard knew of this, and with her, or with Eleanor's advice, they take out Maegor. I think that is very likely. I think that probably was what happened, or something like that. Let me know what you guys think. How do you guys think Maegor died? It's a very interesting topic that we have not had answered within the story, and it's one of the biggest mysteries in all of Targaryen history. So, thank you guys for watching. I know this was a very long video. This one's going to be upwards of an hour. It's a very in-depth video of Maegor's life. I hope you guys all enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys all in the next video. Bye, guys.